Good evening, everyone. My presentation is entitled The Essential Contribution of Wax Cylinder Recordings to Music Research in Papua New Guinea. My guess is that such recordings have been essential to music research in many countries. I look forward to hearing of comparisons and contrasts with your own experiences. Papua New Guinea is a nation located in the southwestern Pacific, just to the north of Australia and to the east of Indonesia. In fact, New Guinea Island is divided between Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. The population is presently estimated to be almost 12 million people. The capital is Port Moresby, where I am now. The country is known for its extreme cultural diversity. Over 839 distinct languages have been identified, the greatest number of languages for any nation. Of course, the media we are considering today are phonographs and cylinders, such as these from about 1902 and 1905. The Cambridge Anthropological Expedition to Torres Strait, under the direction of Alfred Court Haddon in 1898, was one of the first expeditions to use the phonograph for ethnographic research. 6 large volumes were published on numerous aspects of the research over 35 years, but the one concerning music really only concentrates on the cylinders recorded in the Torres Strait Islands between Papua New Guinea and Australia. Little or no mention is made of the recordings that were recorded during the expedition's visit to what was then British New Guinea. But might there have been recordings made before 1898? A newspaper from Sydney in 1893, 5 years before the Cambridge expedition, notes the use of a phonograph by the crew of a Queensland ship recruiting for labor in what are now the Pacific nations of Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands through what are called phonographed letters, recorded documents in local languages from men working on plantations intended for people back in the islands, presumably praising such work and asking them to join him. While Papua New Guinea is not mentioned, it was also a labor market. I am not aware of the existence of any of these phonograph letters, but more research is definitely required. The following 3 maps illustrate cylinder recording activity in Papua New Guinea. Note that these maps deal only with recordings made on cylinders rather than any other technology, namely discs and later wire. The earliest recorded cylinders then are from 1898, and certainly this date remains firm for cylinders related to research. There is an initial concentration of British researchers or those associated with British institutions until 1904. As would be expected, this research focused on the southern part of the country, which was then the colony of British New Guinea. But in 1904, also began cylinder recordings by German researchers. From 1904 until 1918, the end of World War I, such recordings were focused on what was then German New Guinea, the northern part of the country. Recordists were ethnographers, missionaries, linguists, government officers, doctors, and other adventurers. So, thanks to colonialism and particularly the tremendous encouragement and support from Erich von Hornbostel at the Berlin Phonogrammarchiv, many cylinders were recorded and deposited in that archive. Indeed, Susanne Ziegler acknowledges that the time between 1900 and 1914 must be regarded as the most successful in the history of the Berlin Phonogrammarchiv. But note that researchers supported by Berlin also did research in areas outside German New Guinea. Additionally, there were a few researchers from parts of Britain who made cylinder recordings in the southern part of the country too, which was administratively taken over by Australia during this period. Following the end of World War I, Germany lost all of its colonies in the Pacific. Australia took over administration of all of what is now Papua New Guinea. Yet the German interest in research and in recording was not the same for Australians. Some recordings were made by Australian researchers or travelers, but not with the same frequency as German researchers. Some German researchers made recordings too, but again, not at the same rate as between 1904 and 1918. Beyond the colonial powers, that is Germany, Britain, Australia, cylinder collections were also deposited in archives in Austria, Finland, France, Hungary, and the United States, often according to the nationality of the recordist or the supplier of equipment. Perhaps it is also noteworthy that some recordings of Papua New Guineans were not made in Papua New Guinea. For example, in 1906, Otto Dempwolf made such recordings of a number of Papua New Guineans who were sent as soldiers to German East Africa, present-day Tanzania, to restore law and order. The last known cylinder collection of Papua New Guineans was recorded in 1934 to 1938 by a German Catholic priest in the mountainous central part of the country, which had only recently opened up to the administration. In total, over 1,600 wax cylinders were recorded in Papua New Guinea. 86% of these known cylinders from Papua New Guinea are archived in Berlin. It would not be until the relative widespread availability, portability, and affordability of tape recorders that sound recording would become a more common technique for many researchers. Sadly, few photographs of recording activity seem to exist. Here is one from the work of Gunnar Lantman, a Swedish-Finnish researcher between 1910 and 1911, and also recording activity during the Sepik River expedition, 1912 to 13, with recordings made by Adolf Rüsecke. Both this collection and that by Landmann are in the Berlin Phonogramm Archiv. In contrast, and a decade later, Australian photographer and adventurer Frank Hurley is shown here recording in the Gogodala area, 1922 to 23. Hurley actually made 2 trips to Papua New Guinea between 1921 and 23. In 1921, some of his recordings were transcribed for piano. Note that the sheet music here says it was discovered by Hurley, but arranged and composed by Emmanuel Arons. In the preface to this piano music, Hurley notes, "I am deeply indebted to Mr. E. Arons for the great pains taken in transcribing from the original phonograph records. The transcriptions are accurate renderings of difficult subjects, and full justice has been done." End quote. I think even a cursory look at the piano music will cast doubt on any claims of accuracy. In 1960, Australian ethnomusicologist Alice Moyle wrote to Hurley about his recordings. He noted that they had long since disappeared and they were orchestrated by the same man who made the piano arrangements, Emmanuel Arons. These orchestrations were used as accompaniments to his film, concluding, quote, "I'm sorry we did not keep the originals, that is, cylinders, which at the time we regarded as only a means to an end," end quote. Sadly, the location of none of Hurley's PNG recordings is known, although they have been disturbingly rumored to be in the hands of a private collector. Recordings archived in Berlin, however, benefited from the attention of Erich von Hornbostel. Indeed, Hornbostel was essential in getting equipment, the relatively light and easy to transport phonograph and blank cylinders, into the hands of potential collectors traveling to different parts of the world. Giving training in the use of such equipment, corresponding with the recordists during the work, archiving the cylinders upon their return to Berlin, and then often publishing on what was recorded. Of course, analyzing and publishing on the recordings of others is the classic mode of an armchair ethnomusicologist, a role sadly derided today. Yet without such a person, most of the collections considered here would remain unknown. This procedure and Hornbostel's essential involvement was certainly common to many collections deposited in Berlin, and it is due to his efforts that the first transcriptions of music in Papua New Guinea, based on actual recordings, were made. For example, Hornbostel published on the recordings made in 1904 by Emil Stephan, Note on the Music of the Inhabitants of South New Ireland. As was often the case, Hornbostel published a chapter on music in an ethnographic volume written by the collector. In this case, Stephan's book is New Ireland, Bismarck Archipelago, the coast from Umudu to Cape St. George in 1907. Some recordings from this 1904 collection have also been used in the research of ethnomusicologist Kirsty Gillespie and are included on the CD she launched on Lihir Island in 2009, coupled with her own recordings. Richard Turnwald recorded almost 350 cylinders during his research in 1906 to 9. Hornbostel published a lengthy chapter called The Music of the Northwestern Solomon Islands in Turnwald's 1912 book, Research on the Solomon Islands and the Bismarck Archipelago. Turnwald would participate in a number of other research trips and continued to make cylinder recordings. In fact, over 1/4 of all known cylinders concerning PNG were made by him. Here is one of the cylinders transcribed by Hornbostel. I continue to be amazed at the detail of these transcriptions, including main tones, overtones, as well as calculating presumed fundamentals of the individual pipes of panpipes, and in other cases, interval measurements in cents. And Hornbostel published on cylinders recorded by Ernst Fritzi in 1911 in Remarks on Some Songs from Bougainville, published as an appendix to Fritzi's 1914 article, A Contribution to the Ethnology of Bougainville and Buka with Special Consideration of the Nasioi. Here is one of the cylinders from that collection, which is considerably clearer than Turnwald's. Again, I'm not quite sure how Hornbostel hears two voices while I only hear one, but I suppose this is possible. While most recorders of Papua New Guinea cylinders did not themselves write about the cylinders they recorded, one of the few exceptions was Felix Bernstein in his ethnographic contributions from the Bismarck Archipelago from 1916. As the number of recordings archived in Berlin grew, they were also considered by other comparative musicologists, particularly those considering larger geocultural areas or themes of general interest to musicologists. In 1933, Hornbostel was forced to leave his position at the Phonogram Archive because of his Jewish heritage, but others, even beyond the archive staff, continued with the trends Hornbostel had begun. For example, Herbert Hübner focused on what is today part of the New Guinea Islands region in his 1938 study, The Music in the Bismarck Archipelago, Ethnomusicological Studies on Cultural Circle Theory and Racial Research. Perhaps the title also suggests ominous interest developing in academic research. Hornbostel's replacement at the archive, Marius Schneider, attempted to continue Hornbostel's work, but focused more on grand themes in music, such as his 1957 contribution in English to the New Oxford History of Music on primitive music. And in 1969, Schneider published a revised edition of his 1934 book on the history of polyphony. Such writings rely extensively on the wealth of materials from Berlin, including cylinders from Papua New Guinea. But of course, not all cylinder recording was sponsored by Berlin and subsequently analyzed by Hornbostel and his successors. After their initial pioneering efforts, occasional researchers affiliated with British institutions continued to make recordings. For example, New Zealander Diamond Jennis collaborated with his brother-in-law, missionary Andrew Ballantyne, in 1912 to research and record on Goodenough Island. Jennis was a student at Oxford, but there was no Hornbostel-type figure there to do transcriptions or otherwise write about the 94 cylinders recorded, so they have received little attention. Although Jennis actually wrote a book on song texts, it does not appear the cylinders were used for this purpose. Instead, the transcription of the text and translation here is by anthropologist Michael Young, working in the area concerned almost 80 years after the recordings were made. This is part of our ongoing work in trying to find out more about these early recordings, either through work ourselves or in collaboration with others, as in this case. The Institute of Papua New Guinea Studies is a cultural research institution of the Papua New Guinea government, established in 1974, 1 year before independence. Since its establishment, staff have been trying to locate and obtain copies of such early recordings for its audiovisual archive. It is strongly felt that such materials must be available in the country in which they have the most meaning. In large part, such efforts have been highly successful and refreshingly unproblematic. In contrast to artifacts, for example, the Institute does not want the original objects returned, as we lack the equipment and expertise to play back cylinders. Instead, we have received copies on tape, cassette, and now in digital form. Here is a newspaper article on the return of such recordings from Berlin, transferred to reel-to-reel tape in 1987. Apart from just getting copies of these recordings back to the archive, the desire is to reconnect them with the communities concerned. Indeed, this was one of the specific goals of True Echoes, a 3-year project done in collaboration with the British Library, funding agencies in the UK, and various archives in the Pacific. Researchers speaking the languages of the communities in which the recordings were made were hired, given orientation on the project, trained to find out more about the recordings and on the use of the equipment to document their interviews, and to share copies with the people today. A launch of the website was done in June 2022 with participants in the UK and around the Pacific. Frankly, some of this work was successful, some of it disappointing. The recordings are too poor. Traditions have changed so dramatically. Some researchers perform better than others, and so forth. But perhaps it is amazing that the project took place at all. The COVID pandemic disrupted and tremendously complicated many aspects of just about everything. By trying to bring together these early recordings at a government archive in Papua New Guinea, we hope to make people aware of the existence of such treasures, provide access, and encourage research with and on such recordings. I continue to be perplexed as to why preparations for research often involve extensive surveys of written literature, but not the same attention given to audiovisual recordings. Our hope is that by having such recordings available at the Institute, such oversights can be remedied and these recordings can continue to enlighten all concerned. The collections of Papua New Guinea music made by all sorts of visitors, coupled with armchair ethnomusicologists, were essential to early investigations on PNG musics. Even the demonstration collection compiled by Hornbostel in the early 1920s to more widely share the diversity of the recordings in the Berlin archive with others consisted of 120 cylinders, 14 of which, that is 12% of the whole collection, were from Papua New Guinea. Quite an impressive number for such a small country. The intense scrutiny of Papua New Guinea music would not be repeated until much more recent times. For example, it would not be until 1974 that the first dissertation on PNG music resulting from the author's own fieldwork was written. But there is so much more to learn from these cylinders and the traditions they document. Thank you for listening to my presentation.